Good evening, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to the 97th Tahrir Dialogue organized by the American University in Cairo and specifically the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. The Tahrir Dialogues have been unique in that we convene them on issues of common interest to the public and to professionals and to stakeholders, but we only do them, frankly, with very topical issues and extremely high-profile, distinguished participants. Today's event covers both of these. On the one hand, the absence of Arab-Israeli peace has been an issue on everybody's mind in the region here for more than one generation. The book we have today to discuss, Kissinger, the Master, the Master of the Game, is very, very topical because it starts off with a period right after the 73 war and the beginning of change in the Middle East. And I would argue also that the author of the book, Martin Indyk, is also unique in that he's an analyst, he's a practitioner, and frankly, whether one agrees or disagrees with him, he's always been very straightforward and honest in his presentations. I can tell you that in arranging this event, I was very enthusiastic given the topic and given the author. And to add dessert to the meal, to have two highly distinguished professionals and personal friends, Minister Nasser Bouda, the former foreign minister of Jordan, and Dr. Bekat Orani, a very distinguished academic who specializes in this particular topic, is a particular pleasure to me. I will add my remarks after the author and the two panelists. But let me, before doing that, give the floor to Selma, who will be the moderator for the event and manage the process forward. So Selma Ghitani, please go ahead, explain to people how we're going to manage this, and then we'll kick it off and get it going.
Thank you, Dean Fahmy. Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is Selma Ghitani from the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy here at the American University in Cairo. I'm also a media and communication researcher and academic. Let me quickly lay forward the event's timeline. We will start off with Dr. Indyk's presentation in the first 10 to 15 minutes, followed by commentary and discussion from His Excellency Senator Judah, Dr. Korani, and Dean Fahmy in that order, with 4 to 6 minutes each. And then following Dr. Indyk's responses to our discussants, we will give them another 3 to 4 minutes to make any additional comments if they please, and then open the floor for Q&A from our attendees online. I hope you have a nice lengthy Q&A session with room for closing words from our distinguished panel at the end. If you have any questions for our panelists, please write them down in the chat box. You'll find that at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I will read them out to our participants in due time. Please indicate if your question is directed to a particular panelist or posed to the floor in general. And one final comment I'd like to reiterate is that today's Zoom webinar is recorded. All or parts of it may be used for publishing on the school's website or for other purposes. There is also simultaneous interpretation that's available in both Arabic and English. You can find that also at the bottom of your Zoom screen under interpretation. As mentioned by Dean Fahmy, today's book event marks the 97th iteration of the School of GAPP's Tahrir Dialogue series. The series, initiated by the school's founding dean, Dean Fahmy, joins us today for commentary, has been running since 2011, bringing together key figures in local, regional, international arenas, and addressing timely topics with the aim of creating awareness, promoting broad and engaging dialogue between international communities on significant issues in politics and global affairs, in law and communication, among many others. Our distinguished panel for today will be talking about the recently published book, Master of the Game, Henry Kissinger and the Art of Middle East Diplomacy. The book was just published in October 2021. It's written by Dr. Martin Indyk, Distinguished Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, former US Special Middle East Envoy and United States Ambassador to Israel. Joining us from Jordan, We have with us as discussant His Excellency Senator Nasser Joudam, Senator of the Upper House of Parliament of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan and former Minister of Foreign Affairs. Welcome, Your Excellency. And with us today, as well as discussant, is Dr. Bahgat Orani, Professor of International Relations and Political Economy in AUC, who is very well known and appreciated in this field. And finally, our third discussant is also the event's host, the founding dean of the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at AUC, and former Egyptian Foreign Minister Nabil Fahmy. So going back to our panelists for today, we'll start out with Dr. Martin Indyk, who, having witnessed firsthand the political frustrations and disappointments of 3 American presidents' efforts with peacekeeping in the Middle East, takes readers back through his book to the origins of American-led peace efforts, with the man who is said to have successfully led the Middle East peace process from the American side, Henry Kissinger. He relies on archives and declassified documents to narrate what went on, and also presents insights and reflections, having been a specialist in the field and having lived through it through these times as a student. Dr. Indyk states that I have tried to tell the story, both as a historian poring over the records that preserve the memory of what happened, and as an actor in a masterclass seeking to derive and apply the skills and lessons of Middle East peacemaking from a consummate diplomat. I will stop right here and will turn the mic over to Dr. Indyk.
Thank you very much, Salma, and thank you, Nabil, for inviting me to this book talk at GAPP at AUC. This is, I think, the third time I've had the opportunity to speak at GAPP at the AUC, and every time the engagement has been highly educational for me. So I'm excited to have the opportunity to discuss my book with such a distinguished panel of friends and academic specialists. As Salma has laid out, I wrote this book at the end of another disillusioning negotiation in which I was President Obama's special envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations in 2013 and 2014. And after the failure of those negotiations, where I came to the conclusion that the parties, the Israelis and the Palestinians, were further apart at the end of the negotiation than they were at the beginning. And of course, it's easy to blame the two sides for the toxic nature of their relationships and the total absence of trust. But I came to the conclusion that there was something else missing. There was something missing in the practice of American diplomacy when it came to promoting an end to the Arab-Israeli and Israeli-Palestinian conflicts, that there was something that was really lacking. And to try to understand what had gone wrong, I decided to go back to the beginning, to where it all began. And that is to say, the American involvement in an American-led Arab-Israeli peace process. And that, of course, was after the 1973 war, in which Henry Kissinger negotiated a ceasefire at the end of that war, and then used that to launch negotiations between Israel and Egypt and Israel and Syria. He concluded 2 successful negotiations between Israel and Egypt, one Israel and Syria, and as a consequence of that, laid the foundations for the American-led peace process and the American-dominated order in the Middle East. And both of those now are essentially coming to an end. So it was a sense to go back and look at the beginning and trace the arc of American influence in the process and try to understand from that how to and how not to make peace from the point of view of American diplomacy. Henry Kissinger is a controversial figure, particularly for his involvement in the effort to end the Vietnam War, in Chile, in Bangladesh. He's also well known for the top of the Soviet Union and the opening to China. But his Middle East excursions, which really preoccupied him for the 4 years that he was Secretary of State, have not been treated in an in-depth way. And that's what I decided that I would do, taking advantage of the fact that Henry Kissinger, as a man of history and a student of history, had documented every conversation he had, and whether it was in negotiations with Israeli and Arab leaders or in his phone calls with everybody from the President of the United States to Liza Minnelli, all of that is there and available. 95% of it has been declassified, and it is a treasure trove. In addition, the Israeli archives have been opened. The book suffers from the fact that to the extent that there are archives in the Arab world, they're not open. And in some cases, there are no real archives that can be accessed. But, that was a problem I was dealing with. There are many biographies written, particularly by Ismail Fahmy, who was particularly useful in terms of looking at the Israeli-Egyptian negotiations. There's one written by Bethana Shaban about the Israeli-Syrian negotiations. And of course, there are a whole host of other biographies. But that's not the same as being able to actually look at the documents. Fortunately, Kissinger's note takers preserved his exchanges with all of the Israeli and Arab leaders, with the important exception of Anwar Sadat, because Kissinger had conducted his negotiations with Anwar Sadat one-on-one, as we say, 4 eyes only, much to the dismay of Ismail Fahmy, his foreign minister. And so the record we have there is only Sadat's, which is spotty, and Kissinger's own, which is necessarily biased. And that is a problem that I had to deal with. I had the opportunity to interview Kissinger some 12 times, and even though he's now 98, his memory of these events is quite impressive for somebody of his age. So that's essentially what I had to draw on. It's a rich tale. And what I discovered along the way was that I thought that I was writing a book about Henry Kissinger's peacemaking diplomacy. But what I discovered, not from anything that he'd written about the negotiations, but rather from the negotiations themselves that are so clearly documented, was that Kissinger himself was very skeptical about peace, much more skeptical about peace than certainly Anwar Sadat, who was a visionary in that regard, but the Israelis as well, Yitzhak Rabin, and even Hafez al-Assad. And they all were willing to move faster and further than Kissinger was. And this I found quite puzzling till I went back to look at his original book, which was his dissertation thesis. It's called A World Restored, Castlereagh, Metternich, and the Problems of Peace. There it was in the headline, the title of his book. For Kissinger, peace was problematic because the pursuit of it by leaders too eager to achieve an end of conflict could have the effects of achieving the opposite. We call it the paradox of peace, in which by pursuing peace with too much passion, it could destabilize the order and produce war. Of course, what he was referring to was Woodrow Wilson's efforts at Versailles at the end of the First World War, which contributed to the Second World War, and then, of course, the appeasement that led up to the Second World War itself. And so he approached peacemaking with a great deal of caution. Nevertheless, he did believe that it was essential to have a peace process to legitimize the order in the Middle East that he was seeking to build. Before the 73 war, He had relied on the deterrent power of Iran in the Gulf and Israel in the Middle East heartland, and détente with the Soviet Union, in which the superpowers agreed that they should act to stabilize things in the region. He relied on those three factors to create the order that he believed in, the balance of power that was so important to his worldview. But Sadat upended that, and he was quite honest afterwards in saying that he did not take Sadat seriously before Egypt went to war. He regarded him as a, quote, buffoon, unquote, as a character in the opera Aida by Verdi. And so all of Sadat's threats, or more importantly, his peace initiatives that he tried to launch before the 73 war, Kissinger ignored. And I detail in the book the particular episode in which Sadat sent his national security advisor, Hafez Ismail, to meet with Kissinger in February of 1973, some 9 months before the war, with a far-reaching initiative that at first Kissinger was quite excited about, as was Nixon. But as soon as he sat down with Yitzhak Rabin, who was then Israel's ambassador in Washington, and Rabin said, forget about it. We've heard it all before. There's nothing here. And then Golda Meir, the Israeli prime minister, came to town and said the same thing. You know, there's no point in pursuing that. And Kissinger dropped it. And it was only after the war that he came to understand that if he was to promote a stable order, then he needed a peace process which would give the Arab powers, that is to say Egypt, Syria, Saudi Arabia, would give them a stake in stabilizing the order. He wanted to convert Egypt from a revolutionary power to a status quo power. He wanted to take it out of the Soviet orbit and bring it into the American orbit. And to do that, he understood he needed a peace process, not a process that would achieve an end of conflict agreement, a peace agreement, rather a series of steps short of full peace, in which Israel would make territorial withdrawals that it could digest in exchange for some movement towards an ending of the use of force. But that was it. That was his ambition. And his diplomacy was called step-by-step diplomacy because it was incremental. It was gradual. Kissinger didn't believe in exchanging territory for peace. He believed in exchanging territory for time. Time to exhaust the Arabs in terms of their attitudes towards Israel. Time for them to come to terms with Israel. Time for Israel to gain strength with US support, reduce its isolation, and so that when the Arabs were finally ready to end the conflict with Israel, Israel would be strong enough to make the ultimate concessions leading to withdrawal to the 67 lines, more or less, the lines that were there before the Six-Day War, in which Israel occupied all of Sinai, the Golan Heights, and the West Bank. So that was his approach. The peace process was an essential mechanism to the stabilizing of the American-led order that he was seeking to create in the Middle East, and territorial withdrawals were the lubricating mechanism for the peace process itself. But they were territorial withdrawals in tranches, not in one foul, I shouldn't say foul, but he regarded as foul, one big step towards to ending the conflict. As I said, Sadat, Rabin, when he became prime minister, and even Hafez al-Assad, after a couple of years of exposure to this diplomacy, were ready to move ahead of Kissinger. Sadat in particular, as we know, was ready for the big deal and was ready to make peace. And Rabin at that point too also talked about the big step, in which he was ready for a much bigger withdrawal than Kissinger was prepared to contemplate. And I found this fascinating, curious, and surprising. But in the end, Kissinger wasn't ready. He didn't believe in the peace that Sadat was so committed to. And therefore, 2 years after Kissinger left office, we ended up with the Israel-Egypt peace treaty. And I said to Kissinger in my last interview with him, did you ever regret not going for the peace treaty, given that Carter was able to do it 2 years later? And he said, no. He said, if I had remained as Secretary of State, if President Ford had been re-elected, I would have gone for a non-belligerency agreement. In other words, again, another step short of full peace. And he said to me then, I always fear that if I pushed the process too hard, I would break it. For me, that was a kind of light bulb going off, because I, as President Clinton's Middle East advisor at the beginning of the Clinton administration, said to Clinton in our first meeting, look, all the Arabs are, as a result of the Madrid peace process, all the Arab neighbors of Israel and the Palestinians are in negotiations with it. The Soviet Union's collapse, there's no more Cold War. Saddam Hussein's army had just been defeated. There was no Arab military option against Israel at that point. If you put your mind to it, I told Clinton, you can have 4 peace agreements in your first term, and we can end the Arab-Israeli conflict. And Clinton looked at me and said, I want to do that. I imagine that if Kissinger was in the room, he would have said, no, that's much too dangerous. But off we went. And we had some initial successes with the Oslo Accords and the Israel-Jordan Peace Treaty, of course. But then at Camp David, when we tried for an end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we pushed hard and we broke it. And the Intifada resulted. And since then, all trust has been destroyed between Israelis and Palestinians. And despite the efforts of 4 presidents, it hasn't been possible to put the peace process together again in a way that could end the conflict between the Israelis and Palestinians. So there is good reason for Kissinger's caution, as we experienced. But the other side to that is, while it's important, one lesson is it's important not to overreach, but we see the consequences of overreaching by the United States in Iraq very clearly, in Afghanistan also. But while it's important not to overreach, it's also important not to underreach, not to aim too low. And I detail in the book 2 instances of that. I've already mentioned one of them, which was Kissinger's failure to take advantage of the peace initiative that Anwar Sadat was prepared to take before the war in 73, that might well have headed off the war if he had taken Sadat seriously. And the peace process that Kissinger failed to follow, even though I argue and document that it was available to him. The step, I call it the step not taken, in which he had an opportunity after doing the Israel-Egypt disengagement agreement and the Israel-Syria disengagement agreement. He had the opportunity to do an Israeli-Jordanian disengagement agreement, which would have put Jordan back into the West Bank, and I think could have changed the course of history in terms of the way that the Palestinian issue, the Palestinian state, could have emerged in a Jordanian context. And we could have reached a confederation between Palestine and Jordan, something which has proven impossible to do. Of course, that's all conjecture, but it does I think, highlight the dangers of aiming too low. Somehow we need a kind of Goldilocks approach for American diplomacy in the Middle East, in which we are humble and do not try to overreach in our arrogance, in our belief that we can remake the Middle East in our own image. But on the other hand, seize opportunities when they arise to put our weight behind an effort to resolve conflict between the Arabs, the Palestinians, and Israel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Indek, for this very interesting reflection on the book. You touched on several key points that are perhaps comparable to today's political landscape in less ways than one would wish for. The region has been synonymous with instability and conflict for some time. Your account of why and how things that worked back then, the idea of step-by-step diplomacy rather than an all-out diplomacy. All this opens room for the roles of state leaders nowadays in their offices and what you refer to as an art that is either mastered or whose lack thereof can have detrimental effects, as you say. From here, we go to His Excellency, Senator Nasser Judeh, for a discussion on Dr. Indek's commentary. Senator Judeh was appointed to the Senate of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan in July of 2017, and he served as Minister of Foreign Affairs for almost 8 years. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Salma, and my sincere thanks to my brother, Dr. Nabil, for having included me in this panel. Thank you also to Dr. Bahgat and to you, Salma, and your colleagues for your hard work. And of course, thank you, Martin, for this valuable book. We may critique a lot of what came in it, as you yourself have just done in your opening remarks, but it's certainly no downsizing the value of the book and the hours and hours and hours and hours of research that must have gone into it. And there's certainly room for discussion there. First of all, let me, and Martin, you and I worked on these issues very closely at different intervals. I think that nobody can deny Henry Kissinger's astuteness as a wily politician and a very advanced student of international affairs, whether you go back to the beginning, his early book, his dissertation, or his actions as National Security Advisor and as Secretary of State. And you took the words right out of my mouth when you said, by the way, he believed in the step-by-step approach, that he was extremely cautious, and perhaps he wanted to begin a process where what I would add is that he wanted it to remain a process. I would disagree with the fact that it was meant to be a process that would lead to Israel being more accepted and the Arabs being more bold in pursuing peace. I think he just wanted a process. This is the title of the book is telling in itself, Master of the Game. If I may refer to that, to Kissinger, I think it was a game. It was a game of high stakes international politics, and certainly it's a game that has not had an ending in the 50 years since. It continues. Perhaps I would boldly suggest that what Kissinger, and by the way, many other efforts subsequently in different US administrations, what Kissinger did or didn't do is probably the reason why we don't have peace in the Middle East today, a proper comprehensive peace. Yes, we have different agreements. But what you mentioned here that he wanted to lay the foundations for, he certainly laid the foundations for too much process and no peace. And I think this is what we've had over the last 5 decades. At the end of the day, you can't achieve peace with a piecemeal approach. If you want to look at somebody once described it to me as Kissinger in terms of his vision was farsighted, but in terms of his strategy was extremely short-sighted, and I think that's what he wanted, and he was content with that. I want to say that every process, and especially the one that was started by Kissinger, had a ceiling, and that's why we never got to the finish line. Every process had a ceiling. You speak at length in the book, Martin, about the Geneva Peace Conference following the Six-Day War, following the 1973 war, the October War, and the Geneva Conference had a ceiling, and the ceiling was to achieve disengagement agreements, not more. That's what Kissinger wanted. That's what Kissinger pursued through that. The fact that, and by the way, you mentioned, the great peacemakers, and I will, of course, remind that King Hussein, the late King Hussein, was not just a visionary, but a keen peacemaker and well ahead of his time at that time. But I remember when Jordan, and you mentioned Ismail Fahmy and Zaid Rifai, along with President Sadat and the late King Hussein, when we demanded that we should start following the Geneva Peace Conference we should start with a Jordan-Israel disengagement treaty, to which President Sadat, the late President Sadat, agreed. And Kissinger gave the impression that he agreed, but behind the scenes he was privately saying that he didn't want that, but he was just humoring the Jordanians. When we mentioned that Jordan, Israel as a disengagement, and by the way, maybe I can correct a small inaccuracy there. We weren't demanding 4 kilometers. In Jordan, we were demanding 11 kilometers, not 4. But Abba Eban's response to that is, well, that will completely destroy the whole concept of what we're working on. We're talking about disengagement agreements with Syria and with Egypt on the basis of the outcome of the 1973 war. If we're going to get into a disengagement agreement with Jordan, we're going to be talking about 67 lines, and that's premature. And Kissinger obviously agreed with that. Kissinger obviously wanted to have a cosmetic disengagement agreement with Syria. He wanted to have a very concrete disengagement agreement between Egypt and Israel for the right reasons that you pointed out, Martin, meaning getting Egypt out of the Soviet orbit and perhaps neutralize it in terms of belligerency and all that. So yes, he did want to, perhaps as far as Kissinger was concerned, the end result would be a non-belligerency agreement, not a peace agreement. But with Jordan in particular, and you mentioned also the participation of Jordan in the 1974 Rabat summit conference, and I would also beg to differ. It was Jordan that was insisting to go, not Kissinger, who was trying to convince Jordan to go. And we knew the parameters and the dynamics of the Rabat peace conference, but Kissinger wanted that. Kissinger wanted a decision by the Arab Summit of 1974 to name the PLO as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, and thus removing that legitimate card that Jordan had in terms of international law, since it was territory under Jordanian sovereignty. So he wanted that way he can say, well, the PLO is not recognized by the international community or by the United States. We can't talk to the PLO. It's out of Jordan's hands. We have a disengagement agreement with Syria, cosmetic as it may have been, and we have a disengagement with that. And we have now the beginning of a peace process, and let it remain a peace process. I have a few other things to say, which I will keep to the next round at the end. But this is what I essentially wanted to say. Each process, in all the processes that we've had since the early 1970s, had a ceiling. You could not cross beyond that ceiling. The ceiling was to achieve a certain set of objectives. Like I said, whether it was disengagement, and if you look at the compendium of names that we gave to different processes, the Rogers Plan, the Reagan Initiative, the shuttle diplomacy, the Oslo agreements, the Wye River, each one had a ceiling, and that ceiling could not be crossed. And when I'll conclude by saying Kissinger was definitely not just step by step. He was a master, certainly not, in my opinion, of the game, but he was certainly a master of stalling and delay so that he can achieve his objectives. And if it was a game, then it certainly was a game where the umpire was partial to one party rather than the other. And I think that was the failing of the peace process when it began. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, for your insights. You did mention some very interesting concepts, the idea of laying the foundation for too much process and no peace. perhaps an underreach, as Dr. Indek indicated earlier. Also, a game of high stakes international politics is what Kissinger was aiming at. And now let us give the mic to Dr. Korani for his intervention. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Salma. I want to distinguish between two aspects: the book and the author, and the process and the Kissinger. Concerning the book, this is excellent research. Lots of interviews. Martin Indek said that he had 12 interviews with Kissinger himself, but lots with others. Use of declassified and unpublished material. 45 pages of notes, in addition to footnotes in the text itself. All of that with Martin Indek's experience on the ground, talking about people, places. It makes sometimes a lively story with lots of suspense. And actually, that makes that extremely long book, 688 pages, much easier to read, even enjoyable. So well done at this level. If some PhD candidates or young scholars are watching our program now, I would advise them to read the book very carefully to see whether they can add something to it before doing the research. So, complete approval of the process. I think Martin Indek combined the advantages of practice and academic knowledge and tools to produce really a very, very useful book on that period. Now concerning the process, and my colleague just said that it is really a process to go almost nowhere. And basically, when you read the book, I don't know what Martin Indek would think of my description of the process, but essentially, you see a process that is extremely manipulative, Machiavellian, and sometimes deceitful. The operational code of Kissinger was to buy time and to go nowhere. As he said, motion without movement. So my question now, I have three questions, but perhaps I'll ask only the first question this time and keep the other two when I come back. What is the cost of that process? What do we learn from it now? Actually, at a certain time in the book, we have a very important statistics about the number of settlers and settlements. Settlements increased by 233 times. That is one aspect of the cost. The restrictions that these settlers will impose on any Israeli government to come to peace. Martin has mentioned the October War. What other cost can we think of that process, and which would allow us really not to celebrate it so much as the beginning of the Middle East peace, but perhaps as a limitation of Middle East peace that we suffer from up till now? I'll stop here and come back to the other questions in my second intervention. Thank you, Salma.
Thank you, Dr. Bahgat. So the question that you're posing for Dr. Indek, I think Dr. Indek will address after Dean Fahmi's comments, is the cost of the process. What do we learn from it now? So let us give the mic to Dean Fahmi, our host for the day. Dean Fahmi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Salma. Thank you. Martin, and thank you, Nasser and Bagat, for your comments and presentations. Look, I've known Martin for many, many years. We've treaded almost all the roads of the Arab-Israeli peace process, agreed and disagreed on many different things. I think one thing I can say very clearly about Martin, irrespective of agreement and disagreement, you always understood where his position was. He always expressed his position clearly, whether you liked it or not. It was done professionally, but it was clear. And when I look at this book, my first conclusion is it is a must read for anybody dealing with the Middle East Arab-Israeli peace process and or the past, but also the future. I say this because it is extremely well researched. It is full of detail, extremely impressive in the texture of the different events and the context. And frankly, Martin expresses his opinion openly. He says where mistakes were made, where they weren't made, what he thinks the relationships were for the present and the past, and what should be done. And he admits not only Kissinger's mistakes, but also, frankly, America's mistakes in different parts, and also his opinions on mistakes of the regional parties. I want to, however, jump right into the meat of the topic itself. I graduated from college at the very beginning of '74, as the disengagement agreements were starting. And I remember writing a personal note to my father then, who was the negotiator vis-a-vis Kissinger. Yes, Sadat met him on occasion, several times alone, but the negotiations, ultimately, the details were always with his counterparts. And I wrote him at the time, this guy does not want peace, don't trust him. As a graduate from the university. And I remember he told me later that in the middle of the negotiations, when he got annoyed with Kissinger, he took out the letter and gave it to him without telling him who had written it. But that this is a reflection of the sentiment. I frankly believe that Kissinger did not achieve any of his goals, except if it is preserving Israel's security. And I don't think that he succeeded in that, because if he had actually pursued peace, he would have ensured Israel's security much more. But he did not get the Russians out, the Soviets out of the Middle East. Sadat did. Sadat is the one who asked them to leave even before the '73 war. He didn't start the peace, he didn't start the war or support it, and he didn't actually, and the negotiations afterward were conditioned on the act of war, because nobody in the States or anywhere else was taking Sadat seriously when he made initiatives before that. Thirdly, I actually don't believe that there is a stable order in the Middle East. It may be quiet every now and then, but if you look at the amount of violence since '73 onwards, I would argue that this is probably the most serious, detailed indictment of Kissinger's processes that I've ever seen. And probably the one that's going to be most damaging to his legacy. One, because it's written by a professional American, not by somebody who has an axe to grind against it. But I also want to add a couple of more things. I don't agree with all of Martin's assessments, frankly. I don't think that the peace processes after that were a continuation of Kissinger's processes. Not at all. Kissinger did not want peace processes, did not want peace, while efforts later on were an attempt to achieve peace. The peace process started again with the Madrid peace process, not with Kissinger. It was a completely different ballgame then. Secondly, I don't think that being overly ambitious was the problem. It's actually, the problem was that Kissinger burnt a lot of the assets by not being ambitious enough. And I would argue, and this brings a question, I don't want to be too hard here, but it really raises the question of what is America's role as a major power, as a superpower, as the permanent member of the Security Council? Should you be defending right and wrong, rule of law, or simply a balance of power to serve your interests with the Soviets at the time? what you've written here, which I take to be correct, and I know a lot of these details from having lived through many of them, this was clearly a reflection that one of the two superpowers completely ignored violations of international law, was not in support for real peace, and was looking for incremental steps that had no direction. I don't think, frankly, that the choice really was Sadat or Kissinger. They wanted different things. Sadat wanted a comprehensive peace. He wasn't able to achieve it because he didn't have the patience to go through the whole process, and there were other problems. But he achieved ultimately an Egyptian-Israeli peace. Kissinger didn't want peace. Kissinger actually wanted to stop way before Sadat. But let me add, consequently, therefore, it's the absence of a goal that's the problem here, not that we need to do some incremental steps. The second point I'd like to make is, frankly, and I raise this as a question to Martin, in light of the past experiences, should the US actually be the peacemaker in the Middle East in the future? Or should we as Middle Easterners decide, while we cannot ignore you, nor should we want to, we should not depend on you, because if the master of the game doesn't want peace, how are we going to actually achieve peace with people who are not masters of the game? Let me stop with that.
Dr. Inda, would you like to respond?
Selma, can I add just one last point before I forget? I am a strong supporter of America being an active player in the Middle East, but especially in the pursuit of peace. But America has to play the role commensurate with its position in the international community. Martin and I know Martin will remember this. Back in 1996, President Mubarak sent me to see Arafat and to try to help him with the Khalil Agreement. And when I arrived there, the first thing I saw was the Americans measuring the size of sidewalks in Gaza. And the minute I saw that, I said, this is obviously not going to work. If the two parties have gotten the Americans down to that role, then I'm not sure the Americans can deliver on the big picture. I'm sorry, go ahead, Sam.
Yes, I was just giving the mic back to Dr. Indek to respond to our discussants' very interesting questions. In light of past experiences, should the US lead the peace process in this part of the world, or should the Arab states not rely much on them? We have also Dr. Karni's question. We have Dean Fahmi's comments about Kissinger not achieving any of his goals, or did he? Would like you to respond to that, please. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much to all of you for this critique, and I will try to respond to it. In a sense, I will be defending Kissinger, but it's also something that I have come to embrace myself. And Nasser's point, and I think it's reflected in the comments that we also heard from Bhagat and Nabil, is this abhorrence of process and skepticism about what the real purpose here is of an American-led peace process. And I think, I mean, your perspective is completely understandable. I do understand it. Indeed, I understand it so well because I used to be one who said, we've had enough of process, we need peace. That was the position that I took at the time when my colleague, known very well, Dennis Ross, would keep on coming up with another step in the process, and I would make an argument that would be familiar to you. But in the course of this effort to write this book, I came to appreciate the process much more than I had originally. And while I doubt that I can convince you of this, I'm going to try. First of all, it's not true, Nasser, that Kissinger didn't believe in peace. He believed that peace would come eventually. He was skeptical about the pursuit of peace with too much passion. As I said, his approach was incremental, step by step. But the objective in the end was peace. He just thought that in the world of states, conflict was the more normal path or more natural path of engagement between states than a peaceful, normal relations. And so he sought to ameliorate conflicts in order to stabilize the order, because a stable order could reduce conflict, and that could reduce the price of maintaining the order. And so his model was post-Napoleonic Europe, in which Europe had just come through the horrors of the Napoleonic Wars with vast human destruction. And Castlereagh and Metternich had managed to construct an order which, by the way, they flipped France, much like Kissinger flipped Egypt, with Sadat's help, of course. But France became status quo power in the order that Metternich and Castlereagh created. And that order kept the peace, more or less, for 100 years in Europe. Now, of course, there were wars in between, but they were small wars, nothing like the world wars that Europe experienced subsequently when that order broke down. And so that's what he was trying to do in the Middle East. I think one can criticize the whole idea that you could take a European model and impose it on the Middle East, but that's what he was doing in pursuit of order. It wasn't that he was opposed to peace. He just thought that we needed to approach it in a very gradual way. But the direction was peace. And he was a adherent of Immanuel Kant's approach to perpetual peace. But perpetual peace, according to Kant and according to Kissinger, required the exhaustion of the powers, required them to come to accept that peaceful relations should be the way they should conduct their affairs. As I said, Sadat was way ahead of him, and I document in the book the way in which Sadat led him forward faster and in surprising ways for Kissinger himself, because Sadat did not buy onto that approach at all. But that was the way that Kissinger proceeded. Now, the question of the cost of the process is a reasonable one. I think it's important. And as I suggested, and as I show in the book, had Kissinger taken Sadat more seriously, he could have, I think, although this is conjecture, this is a counterfactual, he could have avoided the war had he taken the idea of making peace between Israel and Egypt more seriously. And he could have had, I believe, the peace treaty that Jimmy Carter negotiated between Israel and Egypt. So yes, and when you look at the cost of there being continued conflicts, although albeit not state-to-state conflicts, but the conflicts that have taken place between Israel and Lebanon, and of course between Israel and the Palestinians, have been devastating in their human impact. And so there has been a high cost to the process. The question is, would it have been different otherwise? And there I am fixated on the cost of the effort, the alternative effort to abandon the process and try for an end of conflict agreement. Because that's what I was involved in as a member of President Clinton's peace team at Camp David. Recall for a moment the Oslo Accords. They were Kissingerian. They introduced a step-by-step process. Israel was to withdraw in 3 phases. The Israeli army was to withdraw from the West Bank in 3 phases. In the Oslo Accords, there is no definition of what the end game should be. There is no Palestinian state in the Oslo Accords, no solution for Jerusalem, no solution for the refugees. It's all about a gradual process. And that was Rabin adopting a Kissingerian approach that he had opposed when he was Prime Minister the first time back in the 1970s. And we abandoned the Oslo process at Camp David. Now, we did so for 2 reasons. First of all, because after Rabin's assassination, Netanyahu defeated Peres, and Netanyahu wasn't interested in doing any steps. We managed to drag him after 18 months to agreeing to give up 13% of the West Bank as required under the Oslo Accords, and his government collapsed. And then Barak came to Washington and said, let's go for the final deal. Let's end the conflict. Let's end the claims. And we should do it at Camp David. And so we went to Camp David and we dragged Arafat there. Arafat did not want to go. Arafat wanted another step according to the Oslo agreements that he had signed. He wasn't ready to end the conflict because he wasn't able, in his view, to pay the price that Israel would demand for ending the conflict and withdrawing from the West Bank and Gaza. And so he resisted going, but we demanded it and he came. The end result we know. The attempt to pursue peace with too much eagerness, the attempt to end a conflict that wasn't ready to be ended, resulted in an explosion, the Intifada, and the Israeli response to it. And the thousands of people were killed and maimed on both sides, and the complete destruction of the edifice of peacemaking that we had spent so much time trying to create with Egypt's help, with Jordan's help. And as a consequence of that, it's not only the immense suffering that resulted, particularly for the Palestinians, but we set the whole process back in a way that we haven't been able to recover from. And repeated efforts, the last of which I was involved in, overseeing, to end the conflict through final status negotiations have failed. Whether it's Trump's deal of the century plan or whether it was the negotiations conducted by the end of the Bush administration, part of the Annapolis process, or that I was involved in under Obama and Kerry. They failed. They failed because we could not get the 2 parties to agree on a final agreement. If we had put the energy into an incremental, more gradual process, we would be a lot closer to resolving the conflict, in my opinion, than we are today. And that's why I believe that what we need is to reintroduce a Kissingerian step-by-step process to rebuild trust and to rebuild the process of Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank in steps with reciprocal actions by the Palestinians that can eventually lead to an end of conflict agreement. So in terms of Nabil's point, you know, in light of experience, should the US be the peacemaker? I think that there's reason now to view the American role in a different way. We have seen, and I think it's a mistake to reject the process and reject the eventual resolution of the conflict, the gradual process. Because we have an Israel-Egypt peace treaty today. We have an Israel-Jordan peace treaty today. We now have normalization with some other Arab states, UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan to some extent. So, you know, if you look in the sweep of history, progress has been made. But the big one that remains is the Israeli-Palestinian one. And here I think that Egypt and Jordan, backed by the other Arab states, would do well to pursue an effort to end the conflict precisely the way that we see it now. Look how Egypt is moving in to Gaza to play a role, a mediating role between Israel and Hamas to negotiate a long-term ceasefire. It hasn't been prepared to do that before, but it can do it much better than the United States can. And similarly, although I know that they'll probably give Nasser a heart attack, Jordan can also play an important role in the West Bank. The Palestinian Authority is collapsing. It's crumbling before our eyes. And if that happens, what happens in the West Bank, we know will impact Jordan. So Jordan's role in helping the PA, in the way that Egypt is moving in to play a role in Gaza, can have a very positive impact on getting us to the point where we can resolve the conflict. And the role of the United States, I think, is to support them. But they're the ones who should take the lead.
Thank you, Dr. Indek. Senator Judah, would you like to comment?
Right. Thank you very much, Martin. I mean, I just want to point out at first that when both Nabil and I mentioned that Kissinger did not really want peace, we were actually agreeing with what you said, because that's the proposition that you made, that he wanted a set of arrangements and he wanted to have steps rather than peace itself. So you qualified it in your second intervention by saying that he did believe in peace, but eventually. Now, it reminded me of a conversation with a senior Israeli government official on the margins of an international conference when you were, during the time when you were special envoy for negotiation. And he was trying to convince a group of us that we were going a bit too fast. This is, you know, an Israeli government representative, a senior one, saying we're all going too fast. We need a generation in order to establish trust and mutual confidence, and I don't know what, and we're going too fast and we need to slow down. So my answer to him was slower than 100 years. I mean, you know, how much more can we slow the process down? That's number one. Number two, it very rarely during the processes that we've had, to whether it was, you know, to have certain arrangements put in place or to have certain objectives met, very rarely was Israel timelined or the set of negotiations of the timelined. Perhaps one of the few exclusions or exceptions, I would say, was when under President Obama and Kerry and with yourself also, was when we set the target of 9 months in exchange for 3 batches of prisoners to be released. And of course, Israel felt very uncomfortable with the fact that there was a timeline, because Israel, like Kissinger, believed in, or still believes probably in processes, open-ended, no timelines, that can be disrupted anytime, or that have zero or very little chance of reaching the finish line. But when it was timeline then during the 9 months, they released the first batch and released the second batch, and by the third batch, they said, sorry, we can't, they have blood on their hands and we can't do it, and the process collapsed. That's my second point. My third point, and it takes a lot more than what you said to give me a heart attack, but let me just say that I mentioned in my earlier intervention that in 1974, when the PLO was declared the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, that there was a legitimate hand that was lost, or a position that was lost. But once the PLO was recognized, and once we had our own legal and administrative disengagement with the West Bank in 1988, the whole idea was to support the Palestinians in pursuing their national aspirations on their own, full support. So going back to your point on Jordan having a role in the West Bank or supporting the Palestinian Authority, Jordan will support, but Jordan will not interfere. It is the cornerstone of our foreign policy not to interfere in the internal affairs of other countries, as we expect other countries not to interfere in our internal affairs. So full support for whatever the Palestinians choose as their course, the course that they chart to pursue a peace, to end the occupation, to have their independence and their dignity, most importantly. My last point really is, I take issue with what you suggested, that perhaps we should go back to the Kissingerian approach and launch yet another process. I think you're absolutely correct. It's not just me and Nabil and others like us in this part of the world who basically are averse to the term process because we've seen too many of them. But I think the majority of people find this terminology no longer acceptable. I think we really have to go back to a situation or a scenario where we can pick up from where we left off, not necessarily going back to scratch, to square one, or going back to the drawing board in some cases. There is no harm in going back to where we ended or didn't end, or where we couldn't cross the finish line, as happened invariably. Very last point on the US role. Yes, I think the US has a role to play. You mentioned in your book that in a lot of cases, it's the waning US influence in this part of the world that has caused either a stalling or the inability to be effective in terms of Middle East peacemaking efforts. There is a role that's needed by the United States. Perhaps this time we can turn the equation around and have this role as it should be, because the United States is the only party that can pressure Israel into action. But that doesn't mean that we invite the US to be the peacemaker and sit and watch. We have to do some of the heavy lifting ourselves. We all have to identify our objectives and our priorities and be party to this process. It's not just inviting somebody to come and peacemake while we're just sitting idly by and doing absolutely nothing. So I think the US role is essential, but for the right reasons and with the right objectives, and where it can be truly an umpire, not a partial umpire.
Thank you, Senator Judah. Dr. Orani, you have a comment.
I have a comment and my second question to Martin. We can discuss eternally about the step-by-step, but I don't think it is a good idea to adopt Kissinger's view of order versus peace. He has that opposition between the two. And I think he was captive of his PhD thesis working on the Congress of Vienna 2 centuries ago, the idea of a balance of power and step by step. So I would like very much Martin to comment on that. Is this really the conception that we have to adopt at present? Order, meaning the status quo, versus peace. My question is also, and I think my two colleagues mentioned US mediation. And what do we learn from Kissinger in this process? Because this is really the importance of the book. How can we learn from the mistakes of the past, including Kissinger's mistakes, to establish a better process? And I was struck in the mediation by Kissinger to the flaws that we learn from all experiences of mediation. One important rule of mediation is even-handedness, balance. And reading about Kissinger, he didn't know anything about the Arab side. Nothing. Until he met Sadat and was impressed with him. But actually Martin has a very important quotation about how Kissinger looked at the Arab side. On page 268, he was commenting on the Arab boycott after the October War, the oil boycott. And he says, it is ridiculous that the civilized world is held up by 8 million savages. This is how he described the Gulf Arabs. Are these really good qualifications for a trusted mediator? If we need mediation, what about the characteristics of the mediator that we have to adopt? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Orani. We'll take one comment from Dean Fahmy, and then Dr. Indek, you can perhaps take a round of response. You're muted, Dean Fahmy.
I'm sorry. Again, this book has to be read. It is something people need to read, especially if they're interested in this part of the world and, frankly, in American diplomacy. And you will learn lessons from the content of the book, irrespective of whether you agree or disagree with what happened. The first lesson is the US system is an interactive system, but it's not always as organized and as, if you want, rigorous as one assumes. What Martin shares here about Nixon's position on the nuclear alert, among other things, and what was happening between Rogers and him and all that, it's a reflection that they have their infighting as well as much as anybody else does. And I can tell you I've lived through some of that. But I make this point because America is indispensable if we're going to come to closure. But depending on it too much is a dangerous process for two reasons. One, because they're America, they're a continent looking at the world, their own priorities. It's not only about the Middle East or about our concerns. And secondly, they're not, if you want, as precise on all of these issues that relate to us more than to relate to their competition with, in the past, the Soviets or and now the Russians and the Chinese. But let me add another point. This book confirms to us that changing direction in the Middle East is always from the region, almost always from the region. The 73 war, neither America nor the Russians were in support of the 73 war. We decided to do it. The peace process afterwards was an opportunity. It wasn't an initiation by America. The Oslo talks was not particularly welcomed by America when it started either. And both Martin and I know this, and I'm sure Nasser also does. It took some convincing to get America on board. It took some convincing to get us on board as well, but we were way ahead of America on that point. And finally, even Sadat's decision to go to Jerusalem. If you look at Stuart Eisenstein's book, he talks about meeting Carter in the hallway and Carter telling him, this is crazy, it's going to spoil the whole process. And then Stuart trying to convince him, no, you need to support this process. Again, we can debate the details of each one of these steps, and I have opinions on them. But I make this point because Middle Easterners need to lead. America needs support to bring things to closure. The other way around does not serve the purpose of right and wrong. It may serve the purpose of a balance of power, and that's not in the interest of the Arabs. Sorry for that last comment, Martin, but I do again underline this book has to be read.
Senator Judah has requested to make one final comment before Dr. Indek's responses.
Yeah, thank you. No, I wanted
Senator Judah, we have just a few minutes left. So I'll have
okay. All right. No, mine will be less than 30 seconds, I hope. I just wanted to comment before Martin commented, so we spare him the agony of having to listen to us again. A couple of things. First of all, I do agree with Nabil. This book is a must read. People have to read it. I mentioned right at the beginning that this is a very valuable work. But again, I just want to go back to what I said about 1973 and the Geneva Peace Conference following the war. Martin said in one of his comments that had Kissinger really intended to, he could have ended up with a situation where you avoided the war. But Kissinger himself is known to have said, you know, you can't enter a peace process without having created a crisis. You need to create a crisis before you get results. And I don't believe he was totally unhappy about the war taking place. That's my number one comment. In the Geneva Peace Conference, the idea was you're meant to go and negotiate, have a peace conference, which, by the way, never concluded, adjourned, but never concluded. The idea was to have the basis of that discussion was to be 242, which is the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war, which is land for peace. And it was very clear for the people who attended, and I had a chance recently to sit at length with Prime Minister Zaid Rifai, who was His Majesty King Hussein's point man on this. Prime Minister Rifai, by the way, Martin, not National Security Advisor. He was Prime Minister at the time. So I just want to say that when he suggested that we should pursue a trilateral track, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, starting with Jordan, for disengagement, as per the Kissingerian doctrine, Abba Eban was very adamant, saying, you know, this will take us to 242, and we can't have 242. We're talking about the outcome of 73 and what happened on the ground there. So I just wanted to point that out. Thank you very much.
Thank you to our distinguished discussants. Dr. Indek, the floor is yours. We have just over about, 3 minutes. 3 minutes left.
Ooh. Well, it's impossible to do justice to the comments that have been raised in 3 minutes, but I'll just go over them very quickly. I think that the reintroduction of a gradual process is the only way that we can go at the moment. We simply can't get from where we are between the Israelis and the Palestinians to an end of conflict agreement. We know what it looks like, but we can't get there from here. We have a government in Israel, a left to right coalition that doesn't agree on what the outcome would be. We have a divided polity on the Palestinian side that doesn't agree on what the outcome should be. But we can take incremental steps. Egypt is overseeing an incremental process in Gaza of trying to effect a long-term ceasefire. That's an incremental step. The government of Israel is prepared to take economic steps, not enough and certainly not urgently enough to, I fear, stave off the collapse of the Palestinian Authority, but it's inclined to take steps. There has to be a territorial dimension to those steps, but it's steps that we need to take, not an attempt again to try to get the parties into a negotiation to end the conflict, because that won't work. Does the media have to be even-handed? Bhagat, you could have quoted something else about Kissinger saying about the romanticism of the Arabs. He basically had no idea about the Arabs at all. He'd never dealt with the Arab world before the 73 war. His exposure was very limited. He'd never written about them when he was an academic. Never wrote about the Ottoman Empire, despite his focus on 19th century European international order. And so I think that some of those comments just reflect his you could say, Orientalist approach to the region. But Sadat understood something critical, and he would say it all the time, that because the United States gives Israel so much support, it's the United States that can deliver Israel. And so even-handedness as a virtue for a mediator is important. But in this particular case, influence over Israel is what really counts. And the frustration that many Arabs have with the United States is not really because it's not even-handed. It's because it isn't delivering Israel in the way that they would like. Sadat showed that his approach could yield very effective results, a complete Israeli withdrawal from the Sinai. And Kissinger understood that that's what Sadat was about, and he insisted that Israel make withdrawals. And part of the book go into details of the way in which he managed to convince Israel to give up territory and the arguments that he used to do so. Some of them ended up being counterproductive, but there's no doubt that he succeeded in getting Israel to give up territory much more effectively than any of his successors, except for, of course, Jimmy Carter, because he stood on the shoulders of Sadat. So I think even-handedness is exaggerated. What matters is whether the United States can be effective in getting Israel to give up territory. And that's the way on which I think the United States should be judged. And by the way, it's the reason that to this day, despite the fact that we're not even-handed, Arab leaders, Palestinian leaders who want to make peace come to Washington rather than to any other capital in the world. I think Nabil is absolutely right to caution about depending too much on the United States because we are an outside power, a superpower with other interests. Our interests today, our priorities today are not in the Middle East, but we do have an interest in making sure that this region is less troubled, more peaceful, and we can play a supportive role for those who seek in the region, who seek a more stable order and a more stable peace. Is order more important than peace? My last answer. No, it's not more important than peace. But I do think that Kissinger's caution is one that we should take on board. From an American point of view, our idealistic efforts to remake the Middle East in the image of the United States as a more democratic and more peaceful realm have ended up more often than not in disaster. Not just disaster for the United States, but disaster for the people of the region. So pursuing peace without taking into account its impact on the order is, I think, a mistake and a critical lesson from the study that I've undertaken in this book, that we have to find a middle way, but we make a mistake if we pursue peace without taking into account the unintended consequences, the potential for the way in which pursuing peace can actually achieve its opposite.
Thank you so much, our distinguished panel, Dr. Indak, Your Excellency, Senator Judah, Dr. Oranuddin Fahmy. I think I speak on behalf of everyone who's attended this lecture that it's been a very rich discussion with sound opinions. The questions posed by some of the attendees were similar to the points the discussants made. So I think we've covered a lot of ground today. You mentioned media. I wanted to ask you a question that's media related, being someone from a media background, but perhaps that's a discussion for another time. Dean Fahmy, would you like to close the event for today?
Nothing really more to add, just simply, seriously, I want to thank all three of the panelists. Martin, who's put his heart in this book and I think made a quite legitimate, decent effort in conveying facts and opinions. Also, Nasser Jouda, who I've worked with in different capacities in the past and always has an insightful contribution to make. And then Bagat, who has a strange way of merging academia with practitioners, even though he's not actually a practitioner. So you take sort of from our track of the process, but I congratulate you for that. I've learned from the book and I've learned from this event, and I want to thank all three of you, and thank you also, Salma, for managing this for us. Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you all very much.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, our attendees, for joining us today.